to the effect that it was time to dump the Marcos regime in the Philippines. He said, if you keep supporting the regime in the name of your bases there, you'll lose the bases as well as the regime. Better to dump the regime and risk the bases than to go on in this way. Actually won that argument and argued for the same in Indonesia later on. It's really mainly with him personally that this interpretation in the Middle East is identified, and his view was that the risk of democracy in Iraq, of imposing it, if you like, or if you prefer, releasing it, but at any rate of removing the dictatorial obstacle to it was tremendously risky, but not as risky as carrying on with dictatorship. I think that's a principle worth bearing in mind for everything that you hear about the current very distressing and agonizing consequences of democratic and federal attempts at pluralism in Iraq. They are as nothing, in my view, to the risks of continuing with the Saddam Hussein dictatorship. That's the gamble that's been taken, and that's why we have the extraordinary situation of a president and a vice president who campaigned against Gore and Lieberman, openly saying they were opposed to regime change, opposed to nation building, opposed to humanitarian intervention, opposed to the use of American force for any of these purposes. Suddenly, and who wanted to lift the sanctions on Iraq and on Libya, because they're oil men above all. That was blood for oil, was when the piece of the graveyard of Saddam Hussein was underwritten by the oil companies. That really was a blood for oil. These oil men and conservative Republicans suddenly decide to go to war with the status quo. I've never seen anything like it as a political change in my life since Ronald Reagan decided that the theory of nuclear deterrence and mutual assured destruction was mistaken in mid-administration. Suddenly, you were being told by Republicans, don't you know that mutual assured destruction and deterrence is unstable and immoral? And I said, yeah, I've been trying to say that for 20 years. But this was, of course, when they were trying to sell the Star Wars program. I've never seen a doctrinal change as big as this. The Christian right just goes along, it seems to me. They didn't want this war. If they'd wanted a war in the region, if they'd asked if they wanted one, they'd have chosen Sudan, because their co-religionists are very much involved there, and actually it's to their credit that they've kept the issue of slavery and genocide alive in Darfur and Sudan and elsewhere. Iraq was no big business of theirs. You can find mentions of Iraq in the Bible, but you know, they could have put that off. The real question is whether there'll be a split between them and the neoconservatives, or within them, on the question of the policy of Israel in the occupied territories, or not, and that remains to be seen. But and I'll go there if you like, but I think that will take us miles from Mesopotamia, and I'm in enough trouble as it is.
Andrew, how important is the expansion of the executive powers under Bush? Is it unprecedented? Have we never seen anything like this before? Or is the Bush's administration virtual suspension of the division of powers in all things concerning the war on terror something we cannot turn back from? Can we get to a more balanced state?
Well, we're leaping, and there are really interesting parts of this thing that Christopher just talked about. He's been a big critic of realism. And I have not been myself a realist because I actually believe in international law, which they don't. But as it happens, the realists have predicted one consequence of this war, namely that Iran is going to be the big winner. And we have to recognize, Scowcroft is not my man, but the reason he didn't want it is for that reason. And Iran is now the winner. But this actually could mean a realignment of the realists and the neoconservatives, because it makes, in both of their eyes, Iran, for quite different reasons, the big enemy. I actually think that we're on collision course with Iran. Namely, the United States could not have fought this war in Iraq, lose all this treasure, sacrifice all these wonderful human beings, create all that devastation, lose so much prestige just to hand over the Gulf basically to Iran, which is really a new power, and is making new alliances with the Russians and the Chinese as well, and is going to be just stronger and stronger. Moreover, we have created a kind of premium for them to go nuclear. They might have wanted to go nuclear anyway, but now I think they have to hurry and go nuclear because the United States is not actually able to act very soon, given the fact that we have depleted our land forces in Iraq itself. So actually, we're on collision course, and now the realists, on the basis of geopolitical considerations, would have to actually reevaluate their perspective on this question. Actually, this is not unrelated to Stacy's issue, because the problem in the United States is not just the question of Ashcroft or Cheney or some other people in the Justice Department who don't like civil liberties very much. The problem is the relationship of people like that to the war power. And this issue is not new at all. I wonder if people really realize what is the first moment when the war power is used in a way that points beyond what has been called the Locke, Blackstone, Jefferson model of emergency that has been up to that point prevalent in American history, which sort of consisted in committing acts of illegality in moments of emergency and then posing the question to Congress that whether Congress will support it and the courts, whether the courts will sustain it. Lincoln still did this as late as his suspension of habeas corpus in the beginning of the Civil War. But interestingly, the Emancipation Proclamation is the first moment when the war power is used in a truly modern sense, when he actually does something that he himself thought even a constitutional amendment could not do, because the Emancipation Proclamation actually takes away property in contrary to the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, which the Dred Scott decision explained, and of course one knew before also one could not do. The war power could go further than the constitutional amendment. This is a tremendous expansion of what has now been called the inherent power of the presidency. This is more than just the president doing something illegal in a moment of a situation of dire emergency when you just have to do what you can, as John Locke has already described. Jefferson, for example, repeats during his presidency. This is claiming that the president has an actual legal and constitutional right to do those things and more, whatever winning the war requires. Now, we forget this because Lincoln did it in the name of such a good cause. But it is nevertheless a very, very serious matter because since that time, that power has been expanding. The point is not that Bush has added a lot to it. In fact, they're adding relatively small things to it each time. The interesting line of development, which I try to reconstruct in an article, is always during a war, the presidency in the beginning goes rather far in demanding more and more inherent powers. The courts during the war and Congress too tend to sustain it. Then toward the end of the war or after the war, Congress, well, usually the courts actually first, take away some of the powers, but always something of the new claims is left. And so we have a kind of incremental development toward an increasingly executive-centered government, which in relationship to war and emergency is less and less controllable, at least in a moment of the emergencies. And that's the problem when you are facing a war where the distinction between internal and external has ended, and when the time frame of the war has been extended in such a way that we no longer know. You know, you've written on Orwell.